Good afternoon, my name is Juka Thornton, and as part of my AQ course for Special Ed Part 2, I'm going to be talking about Fragile X syndrome this afternoon. So, Fragile X is caused by a genetic mutation that impedes the normal development between neurons. There's a certain protein that's not developed, and that's what causes the mutation, and it does exist on the X chromosome. Because of that, there's no cure. Only early intervention is very important, and to help children reach their full potential. The fact that it exists on the X chromosome also means that it is much more prevalent in men than in women. And this is why. Hopefully I get this right. Because men have an X and a Y, the genes that come from the X chromosome are the only genes that they get from that chromosome. So it's going to present because there's nothing else to get their genetic information from. However, in females, there are two X chromosomes, and so if one gene is faulty, the other X chromosome the genes from the other X chromosome can present, and so that'll mitigate the effects of Fragile X. So, in men, it's about 1 in every 4,000, and in females, it's 1 in every 8,000. Okay, so how does Fragile X present in children? There are some similarities when it comes to boys and girls. Fragile X is usually detected around 2 years of age when language onset and gross motor skills are noticed to be lagging. Also, there are physical features that become prominent over time. So in the beginning, you wouldn't notice any physical features that are different, but as the child hits puberty, you'll start seeing large ears, a long face, flatter feet, double jointed fingers, and these features become more prominent as the child gets older. In boys, we're going to see a lot of characteristics that include ADHD, autistic behaviors such as rocking, hand flapping, sometimes noises being made again and again, repetitive behavior. Also, we're going to see social anxiety. In 80% of boys with Fragile X, there's excessive shyness. In 50%, that kind of goes into a full social anxiety where they're withdrawing from relationships. Eye contact is very difficult. So those behaviors are very common in boys. The majority of males with Fragile X have significant intellectual disabilities. However, it can range from moderate LDs to more severe intellectual delays. Okay, so in girls, we're seeing the same types of behaviors and characteristics. We're seeing the ADHD, some of the autistic behaviors, the hand flapping. We're seeing the social anxiety. We're just seeing it in a milder version and not as prevalent in numbers. And again, that's because of the attachment of the mutation to the X chromosome. So there's that healthy X that can produce healthy genes to make up for the X chromosome with the mutation on it. So, however, still, 1/3 of females with FX, with Fragile X, have a significant intellectual delay. So, a small percentage of females will present with no symptoms, and they are only diagnosed with Fragile X after a family member has been diagnosed, and then they will test other family members, other female family members, to see if they are carriers. So it is a different presentation, but the same sorts of challenges and behaviors, just kind of a different prevalence. All right. So when we talk about support for parents and the support for children, obviously these children are being diagnosed with issues before they enter the school system. So in Ontario, we have in our community, we have 2 agencies that would be helpful to parents and children in dealing with their diagnosis. First, of course, the parents would notice that something was amiss with their child, and they would go to the doctor, and the doctor would, take them through that initial diagnosis. Once they've been diagnosed, actually, in fact, ROC will assist with that process of identification. If you were to go to ROC, for example, and say, I'm noticing these things about my children, I'm noticing that they're not hitting their milestone. I'm noticing that they're not picking up language like I'm expecting them to. Rock is a place where parents could get advice on where to go, what kinds of things they should be asking their doctor. Rock has play groups for moms. They have new mom activities. They have drop-in times where there is an ECE teacher usually on scene, on site, and those ECE teachers are really great for asking those questions like, when should my child be talking, and does my child present with any delays? So Rock can be quite helpful, especially with those parents who may not have the support of other parents, who may be new to the country, who may not have the understanding of how our medical system works. So the Rock is a really great resource for new parents, parents who don't have that kind of support around them that some parents might. So Rock can help with that initial diagnosis of, okay, you need to go to the doctor and whatnot. So that's Rock. After diagnosis, there's a community agency called Erin Oaks, and they specialize in all sorts of therapies. They have occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy, and they will also do a great deal of education to parents about what issues their child might face, what they can do at home. We had a speech therapist come to our house once for my youngest, who was a little delayed in her language, and so there's a really great partnership between Erin Oaks and at home, and everything is covered in Ontario until the child is 6. That's when my child was there. So Erin Oaks, however, does wait for that initial diagnosis from the doctor. So you need to be referred to Erin Oaks from your doctor. So, but they work well in tandem, and Erin Oaks is a great resource. They also have support groups for parents who may be dealing with different diagnoses and need that support from other parents. So they provide a safe place for parents to learn more about what their child is dealing with. So. Because Fragile X in itself is just the diagnosis, the syndrome or the issues that the children deal with present in a various different ways. It's important that when you go to Erin Oaks that you have that diagnosis, and then they'll start breaking it down of what does it look like in your child. So those community agencies, and they're quite accessible. The Rock especially, it's a drop-in. And Erin Oaks, there is a bit of a wait, but also, I called really early when I had my youngest, and they were quite prompt in at least saying, okay, this is how long you might be waiting. But I think I was in within 3 months. So great, 2 really great agencies in Ontario. So now I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some tips for teachers when dealing with children with Fragile X. It's important to remember that because of the way that children with Fragile X present, it's a huge range of abilities and capabilities. So we first, before planning any program for them, we need to really learn their profile and how much does the Fragile X affect them in their ability to learn and behave in a classroom. So these are just some general tips taken from the National Fragile X Foundation. So number 1, don't force eye contact. Because of that social anxiety that we see in kids with Fragile X, forcing that eye contact is just going to make them more uncomfortable, it's going to make them more anxious, and it'll just really impact the relationship that you're trying to build with them. Expect inconsistency. So kids with Fragile X one day may be able to do a great deal of work, they may be able to focus better, they may be able to achieve more, and then the next day they may not be able to sit still for more than 2 minutes. So it's important that as teachers we understand that this behavior comes from the Fragile X and that we just need to accept it. And if we get frustrated with it, again, they're going to sense that, and it'll just impact our relationship with them in a negative way. So students with Fragile X are learn differently. For example, they're quite good with sight word retention. They will learn their sight words quite well, but phonetics for them is extraordinarily difficult. So learning words as whole words often works better. Also, backward chaining works better with them. Get them to understand what they need to learn, and then kind of work backwards so that they understand where they're headed. If you start from the beginning and they don't know where they're going, that frustration happens very quickly. And also, they really need to see their progress. So checklists of what they've learned so far, celebrations of the steps they're taking are really important with a child with FAX, or with FragileX. Verbal expression for them is, that's number 5. Number 4 is allow and or encourage frequent breaks. Now, the important thing here is to keep them engaged. You want those breaks to be short and kind of intense. So maybe go out and skip in the hall for 2 minutes, and then come right back in. You don't want to leave too much space in there, otherwise they'll become disengaged, and engaging them again will be difficult. Number 5, verbal expression is cognitively taxing. So, when we're looking at ways to get kids to show us what they know, it's important to remember that kids with FragileX, for them to express their knowledge verbally is actually harder than maybe drawing a picture or manipulating something or building something. Just to finish my point for point number 5 is just to remember that different kids need to express their knowledge and show their knowledge differently. With kids with FragileX, we need to just remember that verbalizing their thoughts is very taxing. It's very difficult. All right, so point number 6 is think indirect. So a child with FragileX, mostly because of that social anxiety piece, does not like to be in the center of attention for positive reasons or negative reasons. So if you are wanting to praise that student, praise the student to other students with that child in earshot. Or if you have that relationship with them, do it one-on-one. But you don't want to have the whole group look at that student. They will find that extremely unsettling. Also, when it comes to direct or instruction, you want to try and do an indirect instruction. So perhaps place the child in a small group, in a group of 2 or 3 students, and direct your instruction to a peer, knowing that that student is also able to hear you and is listening as well. You just really want to make sure that you're not doing anything to heighten that social anxiety. Number 8 is work with an OT, knowledgeable about sensory integration strategies. So because we see some of that autistic tendencies with a lot of children with FragileX, we want to make sure that we're really partnering with other professionals in our school to make sure that they're getting that sensory integration that they need. Perhaps for them it's some heavy lifting, do some books need to be moved, right? That feeling of heaviness. Perhaps it's push-ups against a wall. Perhaps it's time in a quiet room. There are sensory triggers for kids with FragileX, environmental triggers that can kind of hyper arouse them, and then it's difficult to have them get back into a calm state. So, as you're watching your student, as you're working with your student, start noticing those environmental triggers. Is it when, during transition time? Oh, and I missed number 7. Is it during transition time? Is that just too much for them? Is it during the O Canada with all the kids standing and singing? Is that too much for them? Is it in the gym with all the balls bouncing? Just making those notes and understanding that there is a tendency with FragileX or kids with FragileX to become hyper aroused, and we want to minimize the impact of that. So we're going to go back to number 7, which is prepare for transition. This is one of those things that is important for all children, but especially so with kids with FragileX, linked to that kind of a tendency to to go into a hyper-aroused state. So that transition gives them that knowledge, okay, this is coming, there's going to be movement in the classroom, there's going to be the sounds of chairs pushing, so that they know what's coming. So you want to do a 10-minute warning, a 5-minute warning. You want to see, okay, is traveling from class to class too much for the student? Then perhaps they need to go 5 minutes early so that they don't get caught up in that wave of students. So just making those notes and doing what's necessary so that transition times in the classroom don't become something that's so detrimental that it impacts the educational time. Okay, so it's also really important to know that children with Fragile X also have strengths that are kind of common to the syndrome. They have an interesting, fun sense of humor. They have an empathic nature. They are always willing, they have a desire to help. They are good at seeing things visually. They have a good visual memory. So we want to, when we're programming for these kids, to really look to their strengths to help them out. So for example, they have a gift of mimicry. So modeling works well because they can see it and then mimic it, and that'll help with them with their learning. They also need to know the purpose of their learning, which again is true for all kids, but especially so with kids with Fragile X. So if they're reading, let's read a menu. And perhaps in their counting, count things that perhaps help you. You know, we're doing an activity and I need so many manipulatives. Can you help me count them? So that they feel helpful and that they understand why they're doing what they're doing. They really need to know that. So know their strengths and work towards them, and enjoy your kid with Fragile X. All right, so here's my list of very interesting references. Clearly very informative, first off. There is actually a fair amount of information online about Fragile X. Its causes, what it looks like. The second one here is a paper that's 200 some odd pages on, as educators, how we can work with them and what that looks like in the classroom. So I think it's important to remember that Fragile X is a cause, that it doesn't name the way the kids present. I think when we say things like ADHD, we know what that looks like. You know, it's a specific set of behaviors that we can kind of recognize kind of as soon as we meet a kid, or at least after getting to know that kid. Fragile X isn't like that. In fact, a lot of kids are diagnosed with Fragile X, or a lot of kids are diagnosed with ADHD and with autism and with different learning disabilities without even knowing that they actually also have Fragile X, because it's ADHD is seen as the issue, not Fragile X causing ADHD. So it's important to know that you have probably worked with a student with Fragile X, or you may have worked with a student with Fragile X and not known it. It's possible that the child has Fragile X and doesn't know it, that their parents don't know it. So that impacts then, of course, the way we work with these kids. I think when I started going into researching about Fragile X, I kind of right away assumed that, oh, Fragile X causes, you know, kind of severe intellectual disability, but that's not the case. It's not that a kid with Fragile X can't learn, or kids with Fragile X will present in an obvious way. So like any student, we have to learn their profile, learn their strengths, weaknesses, learn everything we can about them so that we can build a learning environment that is rich and meaningful for them. We can't assume that they can't do certain things because of a diagnosis. That diagnosis just has to inform how we go about teaching them. So yeah, that was my big takeaway, that kids with Fragile X are not, many of them are not severely affected by it, and that as an educator, it's my job to just teach them ways to overcome it, teach them ways to learn with what they have. So that's it, that's what I have so far. My questions for you are, thinking about the tips that I presented, what are some specific ways that perhaps in your grade, what would that look like, and how would you go about it? I'm also challenging you to read a little bit more about it. So the first one here, the National Fragile X Foundation, is where I got those top 10 tips, and they also have more resources for teachers. So I look forward to talking to you online and starting a discussion about specifically what does that look like, and in your classroom, in your practice, and whether or not you'd heard about it before, or if you made some of the same assumptions I did. So thanks very much. Have a great